cold, rich cowboy refused every bride, until a quiet young woman melted his walls. Jack Harlan stood tall on his ranch, his eyes scanning the vast expanse of land that stretched out before him. It was a land he had fought hard to claim, a place he had turned into something valuable with nothing more than his grit, determination, and years of sweat and labor. His ranch, located in the rugged heart of the West, was known far and wide, not just for the quality of cattle he raised, but for the fierce independence Jack had cultivated over the years. He was a man who had everything, except what his heart truly yearned for. To the people around him, Jack was a mystery. He was cold, unapproachable, and gave nothing away. There were those who whispered about him, calling him a man whose heart had turned to stone. And they were right, but not for the reasons they thought. It wasn't that Jack lacked the capacity to love, but rather that love had been something he had learned to shut out long ago. His past had taught him that love could only bring pain, and he had no intention of letting it back into his life. For as long as he could remember, Jack had kept his distance from relationships. The men who worked for him on the ranch respected him, and the women in town often looked his way with admiration. But Jack was steadfast in his refusal. His heart had been broken once before, and he wasn't about to let anyone have the power to break it again. The last time he had let a woman into his life had left a scar that he couldn't erase. That woman had promised him everything, and in the end she had taken it all away, leaving him with nothing but bitterness and a deep, aching loneliness that he refused to acknowledge.
Jack's rejection of love wasn't born out of arrogance or pride.
It was born out of fear. Fear that he might let someone close, only to have them hurt him, the way he had been hurt before. So, Jack buried himself in his work. The ranch became his life. The cattle, the fields, the dust, the long, grueling hours, they were all that mattered. There was no room for anything else. He didn't need a wife, a family, or even a friend. He had his land, his cattle, and that was enough. Every season there were women who came and went. Some were young and eager, others were older, seeking a stableman who could give them a home. They came to him with smiles and fluttering eyelashes, hoping to catch his attention. But Jack didn't notice. He had long ago shut off the part of him that could feel anything more than indifference toward them. He would politely decline their advances, offering a simple, "I'm not interested," and that was that. He wasn't cruel. He just wasn't willing to let anyone into his life. He didn't need them, and he didn't want to want them. But there were times when in the quiet moments of the evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the ranch settled into a peaceful stillness, Jack would find himself alone with his thoughts, and that's when the loneliness would creep in. It was an ache that he tried to ignore, burying it beneath his work and his stern demeanor. He had built this wall around himself so high that it was hard to remember what it was like to feel anything else. But sometimes, when the world was quiet and his mind wandered, he would think of what could have been. He thought of the days when love had seemed possible, when he had trusted someone with his heart, and then he would push those thoughts away. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford. He had no room for it in his life. Jack's wealth didn't make him happy. It never had. He had worked for every penny, every acre of land, every head of cattle. But it was all a means to an end. He didn't need it for comfort or for pride. He needed it because it was all he had. He had nothing else. And so he lived his life in solitude, walking the same dusty path every day, never allowing himself to dream of something more. The townspeople had long given up on trying to change his mind. They had seen Jack at church on Sunday, standing rigidly at the back, his gaze never meeting anyone's. They had seen him in town, his face hard and unreadable as he went about his business with little more than a polite nod. They had tried to set him up with their daughters, hoping to break through his emotional walls, but Jack's rejections were always firm, always kind, but always final. He didn't care for the social events in town, the balls and gatherings where people came together to drink and dance. He had no interest in the flirtations and promises made in the flickering candlelight, and he wasn't interested in the women who came to him with hopeful smiles. They saw his wealth, his power, his land, but they didn't see the man behind it. They didn't see the man who had learned to guard his heart, like a fortress. And that was just fine with Jack. At times, he felt a flicker of guilt for not being more like the other men in town, who had families, wives, and children. They seemed to have it all, and Jack sometimes wondered what it would be like to have someone to come home to at the end of the day, someone who would listen when he needed to talk, someone who would stand by him through the highs and lows. But then the thought would pass, and he would remind himself why it wasn't worth it. The pain of losing someone was far worse than the emptiness of living alone. And so he kept to himself, determined to remain unaffected. His life was one of routine. Wake up early, ride the range, tend to the cattle, check the fences, and work through the evening. There was always something to do, always a task to complete, and it was enough to fill the emptiness. It had to be enough. But Jack had no idea that everything was about to change. He had no idea that the walls he had spent years building around his heart were about to be tested in a way he could never have imagined. It wasn't until the day Emily Rhodes came into his life so unexpectedly that Jack realized that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong about everything. Jack didn't know it yet, but Emily would be the one to challenge everything he had ever believed about love, about himself, and about what it meant to truly open up to someone. It would take time, patience, and a series of moments that Jack couldn't have planned. But from that day on, everything would begin to shift. The walls he had so carefully constructed were about to be cracked, and the cold, rich cowboy who had refused every bride would find himself on a path he never expected, one that would lead him to a love that would change him forever. Jack had always prided himself on his ability to keep people at a distance. It wasn't just a skill, it was a way of life. He didn't let anyone get close. It was easier that way. He was accustomed to the solitude of his ranch, surrounded by the endless horizon and the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. There was peace in that silence, peace in the solitude that no one could disrupt. But everything changed the day Emily Rhodes entered his world. It was an afternoon like any other when Jack first saw her, though he would later realize that he would never forget it. He had ridden into town for supplies, a task that he usually found tedious but necessary. The sun was hot, the streets dusted with the familiar dirt that seemed to coat everything in the West. As he walked past the general store, his eyes caught sight of a young woman standing near the porch. She was looking down at the ground, seemingly lost in thought, her brown hair gently swaying in the breeze. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about her at first glance. She wasn't the type of woman Jack usually took notice of. She wasn't dressed in the fine clothes of the women who often visited his ranch or the more fashionable women from the nearby towns. Her dress was simple, practical even, and her demeanor was calm, almost reserved. She wasn't trying to catch anyone's eye, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made Jack pause for a moment. She looked up then, catching Jack's gaze. Her eyes were warm, but there was a quiet strength about them. She didn't smile immediately, nor did she turn away awkwardly as many women would when they caught someone staring. Instead, she simply held his gaze for a moment before looking back down at the small bundle she was holding in her arms, a basket filled with what looked like fresh herbs and vegetables. Jack couldn't help but feel something stir in him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He had seen women before, many, in fact, but there was something different about Emily Rhodes. She wasn't like the others. There was no pretension about her, no calculated grace. She was simply herself. There was something in her simplicity that drew him in, though Jack couldn't understand why. He quickly looked away and walked into the store, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had taken root in his chest. The rest of his visit to town passed in a blur. Jack couldn't stop thinking about Emily. He had no idea who she was or where she came from. But every time he tried to focus on something else, his mind returned to her. The way she had looked at him with calm eyes, the soft way she carried herself, the stillness about her that contrasted so sharply with the noise and bustle of the world around her. When he returned to the ranch, Jack tried to push the thought of Emily from his mind. He had more important things to do. Ranch work, cattle to tend to, fences to repair. There was no room for distractions. Yet no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't help but wonder who she was. He had never seen her before in town, and that intrigued him. Most of the people in the small town knew each other by name, but she seemed like an outsider, someone who had slipped into the town unnoticed. until now. The next time Jack rode into town, he found himself once again passing by the same porch where he had seen Emily. This time, he couldn't help himself. He slowed his horse and looked around for her. It was as though something invisible was pulling him toward her. And then, just as he had hoped, there she was, standing in front of the store, talking with an older woman Jack recognized as the town's schoolteacher. Jack had seen many women in his life, but none had made him feel the way Emily did. She wasn't loud or bold, trying to catch his attention. She didn't wear bright colors or flashy jewelry. Instead, she wore a simple brown dress, and her brown hair was loosely tied back, a few strands gently framing her face. As she laughed softly at something the schoolteacher said, Jack found himself mesmerized. There was no reason why he should be feeling this way, and yet he was. He knew he should ride on, get his supplies, and head back to the ranch. But instead, he found himself tying his horse to the post outside the store. Before you knew it, he was walking over to where Emily stood. "Miss Rhodes," Jack said, his voice sounding a bit gruff as he approached. He cleared his throat, unsure of what to say next.
"I don't believe we've properly met. I'm Jack Harland."
Emily turned to face him, her eyes soft but curious. "Mr. Harland," she replied politely, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "It's a pleasure." Jack could feel his heart beating faster than usual. He was used to people greeting him in a formal manner, but Emily's greeting felt different, more genuine somehow. He had spent so many years keeping everyone at a distance, building walls around himself that no one could breach. But now, standing before this quiet young woman, those walls seemed to be crumbling before his very eyes. "I've seen you around town," Jack said, his voice a little softer than he intended.
"But I don't think we've had the chance to speak."
"No, we haven't," Emily replied. "I'm new to town. My family just moved here from the East." The casual mention of her background made Jack more curious. "From the East, huh?" he said, trying to keep the conversation going. "What brings you out this way?" Emily hesitated for a moment as though deciding how much to share. "My father is the new schoolteacher. He was offered a position here, and we decided to make the move." She glanced around briefly, her eyes taking in the surroundings. "It's different here than what I'm used to, but I think I'll manage." Jack nodded, taking in her words. There was a quiet determination in her voice, something that intrigued him even more. He had expected a young woman from the East to be more eager to leave, but Emily didn't seem bothered by the change. Instead, she seemed at ease with it, almost as if she had learned long ago how to make the best of any situation. "Well," Jack said, his voice a bit awkward now, "I won't keep you from your errands. It was nice to finally meet you." Emily smiled again, this time more warmly. "Likewise," she said before turning her attention back to the schoolteacher. Jack stood there for a moment longer, unsure of what to do. He had never been good at these social exchanges, especially with women, but something about Emily made him want to stay, to keep talking, to learn more about her. He knew that if he didn't leave soon, he might do something completely out of character, like invite her to dinner or ask her to join him for a ride, something that he knew would be risky, something that could break down the walls he had spent so many years building. But for now, Jack Harlan knew that he needed to return to his ranch, to the work that kept him grounded, and to the isolation he had grown so accustomed to. Yet, as he rode back to his ranch that day, Emily's face lingered in his mind. It wasn't just her quiet presence that had intrigued him, but the softness in her eyes, the calmness in her voice, and the strength that seemed to reside within her. Jack couldn't help but feel that in some way Emily had already begun to chip away at the walls he had spent so long protecting. Jack's thoughts were restless as the days passed. The image of Emily Rhodes lingered in his mind like a soft melody he couldn't shake. Each time he tried to focus on the tasks at hand, tending to his cattle, repairing fences, or managing the daily grind of the ranch, he found his mind wandering back to her. It wasn't just her appearance that intrigued him, though she was undeniably beautiful in her own quiet way. It was something deeper, something in the way she carried herself with such calm and grace, something that drew him in without effort. For the first time in years, Jack found himself wishing for more than the solitude of his ranch. He had never allowed anyone to get too close, but Emily was different. There was no rush or pressure with her, no forceful gestures to try and win his attention. She was simply there. In a world that often felt loud and overwhelming, Emily's presence felt like a calm breeze, gentle and steady. Jack tried to ignore the tug in his chest every time he thought of her. It was an unfamiliar sensation, one that he had long pushed aside, telling himself it wasn't worth entertaining. Love, he had learned, was a dangerous thing. It could make a man weak, vulnerable. It could leave him open to betrayal and heartbreak. So he buried the thoughts of Emily deep inside, convincing himself that he had no room for such distractions in his life. But fate has a way of challenging our best intentions. Several weeks after their first meeting, Jack found himself once again in town for supplies. As he rode into the heart of the small village, he spotted Emily standing by the well, her hands busy with a basket of water. Her long dark hair was loosely tied, and her simple dress fluttered gently in the wind. She was talking to a young child, perhaps one of her father's students, as they laughed together. There was a kindness in her smile, a warmth that Jack hadn't seen in anyone else. As he approached, Emily looked up and noticed him almost immediately. Her eyes softened, and her lips curled into a small, friendly smile. Jack, caught off guard by the ease with which she greeted him, felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest. "Mr. Harland," she said, her voice calm and pleasant, though it had a quiet strength to it. "It's good to see you again." Jack nodded, unsure of what to say. The last time they spoke, their exchange had been brief and polite. He had made his excuses, avoiding anything that might hint at deeper interest. But now, standing before her, he found himself wanting to continue the conversation. "Miss Rhodes," he said, his voice a little rougher than he intended, "I didn't expect to see you here today." Emily shrugged, her smile never faltering. "I often come to the well for water in the afternoons. It's peaceful here." She glanced over at the child who had been standing beside her. "This is Tommy. He's been asking me about the flowers in the field, so I've been showing him a few things." Jack looked down at the child, who was still holding on to Emily's skirt. The boy gave him a shy smile, which Jack returned, though the experience was unfamiliar. He wasn't used to interacting with children, and he found himself unsure of how to proceed. Emily, however, seemed completely at ease, as though this was all part of a normal day. Tommy waved and ran off toward the nearby schoolhouse, and for a moment, it was just the two of them, standing in the quiet of the village square. Jack shifted his weight uneasily, suddenly aware of how awkward he felt. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said, clearing his throat. I noticed you and thought I'd say hello." Emily chuckled softly, her eyes glinting with something like amusement. "You didn't interrupt," she said. "I was just showing Tommy a few things. There's no harm in that." For a long moment they stood in silence, neither knowing quite what to say. Jack was used to keeping his thoughts to himself, and Emily seemed perfectly content with the quiet, as though words weren't necessary to enjoy the moment. Jack, however, was struggling to make sense of what was happening inside him. He hadn't expected to feel this way, to be so caught off guard by someone who wasn't trying to impress him or gain his favor. Emily was simply herself, and that, in itself, was something Jack wasn't sure how to handle. "I've been meaning to ask you," Jack said after a pause, his voice breaking through the quiet. "How are you finding the town, settling in well?" Emily's smile softened as she thought for a moment. "It's different," she said slowly, "but I like it here. There's something peaceful about it. I'm used to a faster pace, but I think I could get used to this." Jack studied her, watching the way she looked around at the town square with a thoughtful expression. It was as though she saw things others might miss. The quiet beauty in the little details, the simple pleasures of life. She wasn't looking for something bigger or better. She seemed content in the present, in the here and now. "Where are you from?" Jack asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Before you came here, I mean." Emily hesitated for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. "We're from the East," she replied. "I grew up near Boston, actually. My father was a teacher there before he decided to take this position." Jack nodded. He had never been to the East, but he knew enough about it to understand that it was a world far removed from the wide open spaces of the West. People were busy there, always rushing from one place to another, always with something on their mind. Emily, however, didn't seem to fit that fast-paced world. She was calm, unhurried. And in that moment, Jack realized that it was that very calmness that made her stand out to him. "Must be a big change, then," he said quietly. Emily nodded, a small smile crossing her face. "It is," she admitted. "But I'm learning to appreciate the stillness here. It's different, but I think it's good for me." Jack felt a strange tug in his chest. He had spent his entire life running from emotion, burying it beneath the weight of work and responsibility. But Emily didn't seem to be running at all. She simply accepted the quiet, the peace, the slow pace. She was willing to take things as they came, to learn from them, to grow with them. It was in that moment that Jack realized he had been wrong about her all along. She wasn't just a passing stranger. She was someone who understood the things he had been running from. Someone who could help him face the things he had buried deep inside. For the first time in years, Jack felt the walls around his heart begin to crumble, piece by piece. "I should go," Jack said, his voice low. "I've got work to do on the ranch." Emily nodded, her smile still gentle, but something in her eyes told Jack that she understood. "I'll see you around, Mr. Pick." "Harland," she said softly. Jack tipped his hat and walked away, but this time the heavy weight of solitude didn't feel as comforting as it once had. For the first time in a long time, Jack Harland found himself wondering if it was time to let someone in. As the days passed, Jack found himself becoming more and more distracted. It wasn't a sudden shift, more like a slow, steady pull that he couldn't resist. Every time he rode into town, his eyes would scan the streets, searching for a glimpse of Emily. It wasn't that he expected to see her every time, but when he did, it was like the world seemed just a little brighter, the air a little lighter. She wasn't the loudest person in the room, nor the most flashy, but there was something about her that made her stand out. She had this quiet strength, this calm that seemed to settle over everything she touched. Jack hadn't expected this, not at all. For so long, he had convinced himself that he was perfectly content on his own, that he didn't need anyone else to be complete. The ranch was all he needed, and that's how it had been for years. But now, with each passing encounter with Emily, he realized that maybe he had been fooling himself. He had been so focused on protecting himself from the pain of love that he had closed off the possibility of something more.
And now, with Emily, he was beginning to question everything.
The first few weeks were small moments, a shared glance, a quiet conversation by the well, the occasional smile exchanged when they crossed paths. Jack told himself that he was just being polite, that there was no reason to let it go any further. But then, one evening when the sun was setting behind the hills and the ranch was quiet, Jack found himself standing by his window, looking out over the land and thinking about her. He had always been a man of action, a man who preferred to keep things simple and straightforward. But with Emily, everything felt different. There was a complexity to her that intrigued him. She wasn't asking for anything from him, but somehow, he felt the need to offer more of himself to her, something he had never done with anyone else. And that scared him. It scared him because it was unfamiliar. It wasn't something he had planned for, nor something he could control. That night, as Jack sat alone in his study, he found himself replaying every conversation they had ever had. Her voice, soft and steady, echoed in his mind. Her smile, the way it reached her eyes and made everything around her seem less heavy. It was all so simple, and yet it felt like it meant something more than he could understand, and for the first time, he didn't want to ignore it. He didn't want to push it away. He wanted to explore it. The next day, as he rode into town, he told himself he would stop by the schoolhouse to see if Emily was there. He wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe just a simple chat, a chance to spend more time in her company. But when he arrived, the schoolhouse was empty. It was then that he realized he had no idea where she went after her teaching duties were done. He hadn't thought about it before, but now he couldn't help but wonder. Where did she go when the day ended? Did she have other plans, or was she simply content to return to the quiet of her home? As he stood in front of the schoolhouse, Jack's thoughts turned to the future. He wasn't a man who typically made plans. He didn't need to. The ranch had always been there, steady and reliable, and it had been enough. But with Emily, things felt uncertain, unpredictable, and that, Jack realized, was both terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. He turned and began walking down the street, unsure of what he was looking for. His boots echoed against the pavement, the sound steady and rhythmic. And then, as if by fate, he saw her. Emily was standing near the edge of the square, talking to a group of children who had gathered around her. They were laughing and asking her questions, and Jack couldn't help but notice the way she was so naturally at ease with them, the way she listened intently and responded with such patience. It was clear she cared deeply for the people around her, even the youngest of them. Jack hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should interrupt. But before he could decide, Emily turned and noticed him standing a little ways off. Her smile was immediate, warm, and genuine. She excused herself from the children and walked toward him, her steps light and effortless. "Mr. Reyes." "Harland," she greeted him, her voice a soft melody that seemed to make everything else fade into the background. "Miss Rhodes," Jack replied, his voice unexpectedly rough. He cleared his throat, tried to steady himself. "I didn't mean to disturb you."
"You're not disturbing me," Emily said with a smile.
I was just finishing up with the children. They always have so many questions about the plants and animals around here.
She glanced over her shoulder, and Jack could see the affection in her eyes as she looked at the group. They make every day feel a little more alive. Jack couldn't help but smile. There was something about the way she spoke, the way she made everything seem so natural and uncomplicated. "You've got away with them," he said quietly. Emily shrugged, a modest gesture. "I enjoy teaching them. It's been a good change of pace." Jack nodded, but his thoughts were already elsewhere. He was standing so close to her now, and he couldn't ignore the fact that he felt something different this time. There was an energy between them, a tension that hadn't been there before. He wasn't sure if she felt it too, but he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her. It was like a magnet drawing him in, and for once, Jack didn't want to resist. "I was hoping we could talk," he said, surprising himself with the words. "Maybe take a walk or—" "I'd like that," Emily interrupted, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that made his heart skip a beat. "I've been wanting to spend more time with you, Mr. Harland. I think we have a lot to learn from each other." The words hung in the air between them, simple but profound. Jack realized in that moment that he had spent so many years pushing people away, convinced that he didn't need anyone, that he had everything under control. But now, standing in front of Emily, he understood that he didn't have to do it alone. He didn't have to live in isolation anymore. There was more to life than just work, than just the ranch. There was connection, and understanding, and love. And maybe, just maybe, Emily was the one who could show him that. They walked side by side, not saying much at first, but Jack didn't mind. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding, a shared space where words weren't always necessary. And as they walked through the town, Jack felt something shift within him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel afraid of it. He felt ready to face whatever came next. And with Emily by his side, maybe he could finally let go of the past and begin something new. As the weeks passed, the bond between Jack and Emily grew stronger. It wasn't something that happened overnight. Instead, it was a gradual unfolding, like a flower opening up in the quiet of the morning. Jack had never been one to share his thoughts easily, but with Emily he found himself doing just that. She had a way of making him feel comfortable, a way of drawing out the words he had kept buried for so long. She didn't rush him, didn't push him to talk. She simply listened, patiently and without judgment, and that made all the difference. Their days together were simple but meaningful. They would walk through the town talking about everything and nothing, about the weather, the animals, the things that made up their daily lives. Jack would listen as Emily spoke about her family back east, her childhood, and the changes she had experienced since moving to the West. It was a different world from the one Jack knew, but the more he listened, the more he realized how much they had in common. Both had come from different places. Both had faced challenges, but neither had let those challenges define them. Emily's laughter became a sound that Jack looked forward to. It wasn't loud or brash, but it was real, warm, and genuine. It was a kind of laughter that made Jack forget about the walls he had spent years building around his heart. For the first time in a long time, Jack allowed himself to let go of the past and simply enjoy the present. Emily had a way of making him feel as though everything was going to be okay, no matter how uncertain the future seemed. One evening, after a long day of work on the ranch, Jack invited Emily to join him for a ride out to the hills. It was something he had done many times before, but this time it felt different. This time he wasn't riding alone. As they made their way through the fields, the evening sky stretched out before them, painted with soft hues of orange and pink. The air was crisp, and the sound of their horses' hooves was the only sound that filled the silence. Jack could feel the weight of the day lifting off his shoulders as he rode beside Emily. It was peaceful here, just the two of them in the quiet of the vast open land. "Do you ever feel like you're just meant to be here?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. Jack glanced over at her, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" he asked. "You know," she said softly, "like all of this, the ranch, the land, the quiet. It feels right, doesn't it? Like it's where you're supposed to be." Jack thought for a moment before answering. "I never really thought about it that way," he admitted. "I've always just worked, kept to myself. But I guess maybe it does feel like it's where I'm supposed to be, at least now, with things changing." Emily smiled gently, her eyes meeting his.
Things change, Jack.
"Life doesn't stand still, even when we try to make it." The words hit Jack in a way he hadn't expected. Emily was right. He had spent so much of his life trying to control everything, trying to keep things the way he wanted them. He had built his world around routines, around work, around keeping people at a distance. But now, with Emily in his life, he was starting to see that maybe it was time to let go of some of that control. Maybe it was time to let life move forward, to let it change. The ride continued in comfortable silence, and Jack found himself thinking about everything that had led him to this point. He had spent so many years building walls, convinced that they would protect him from the pain of loss. But now, with Emily, he was starting to see that walls weren't the answer. Walls kept people out, yes, but they also kept people from getting in. They kept love and connection at bay. And Jack realized that, more than anything, he didn't want to live like that anymore. As they reached the top of the hill, Jack dismounted from his horse and stood for a moment, looking out over the land below. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over everything. Emily joined him, standing by his side. Together, they gazed out at the wide expanse of the ranch, the quiet fields stretching as far as the eye could see. Jack had always found comfort in the vastness of the land, in the space and solitude it provided. But now, standing next to Emily, he realized that the vastness wasn't as important as the person standing beside him. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Jack said, his voice low. Emily turned to him, her expression gentle. "What about?" "About everything," Jack said, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "About the ranch, about my life, about you." Emily didn't say anything, but her silence was understanding, as though she was giving him space to say what he needed to say.
"I've spent so long thinking that I could handle everything on my own," Jack continued.
"That I didn't need anyone. But being with you, I've realized that maybe I was wrong." Emily's eyes softened, and she reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not alone, Jack," she said quietly. "You never have to be." The words settled in Jack's heart, and for the first time in years, he felt the heavy weight of isolation begin to lift. Emily wasn't asking him to be something he wasn't. She wasn't asking for anything other than his honesty and his presence. She accepted him as he was, with all his flaws and baggage, and that was something Jack had never thought he would find. The moment was simple, but it was powerful. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he was finally at peace. He didn't have to hide behind walls anymore. He didn't have to keep pushing people away. He could let himself feel, let himself love, and in return, he could give that love to someone who truly understood him. As the sun set behind the hills, casting a soft glow over the land, Jack turned to Emily and smiled. For the first time in his life, he knew that he was ready to open his heart to the possibility of a future with her. And it was a future that, no matter how uncertain, felt like the right one. "Emily," Jack said softly, his voice steady. "I think I'm ready." "Ready for what?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "Ready to let you in," Jack replied, his heart pounding in his chest. "Ready to see where this goes, to see where we go." Emily's smile was gentle, but there was a spark in her eyes. "I've been waiting for you to say that," she said quietly. The walls he had spent years building were finally gone, replaced by something stronger, something that had been there all along, just waiting to be discovered. It was love, and it was real. And for the first time in his life, Jack Harlan was ready to embrace it, with Emily by his side.